It is April 9th, 1483. The bells of London toll, echoing news that would shake the kingdom to its very foundations. Edward IV, the Yorkist king who had clawed his way to power through the brutal Wars of the Roses, is dead. He leaves behind not only a fragile peace, but also a precarious future. The crown, heavy with blood and intrigue, passes to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. At his side is his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, two boys destined to carry the weight of England's destiny. But fate and the ruthless ambitions of those around them would not grant them innocence for long. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, entrusted as protector of the young king, soon maneuvers to declare the boys illegitimate. Parliament, swayed by political manipulation, brands Edward IV's marriage invalid. With the stroke of a quill, the princes are stripped of their birthright, leaving Gloucester to seize the crown as Richard III. It is a masterstroke of power politics, yet one that sets into motion one of the darkest mysteries in English history. The two young heirs, imprisoned in the Tower of London, are seen playing in the gardens, and then suddenly vanish. No burial, no official record, no trace. Whispers of murder spread like wildfire. Did Richard order their deaths to secure his throne? Or were they eliminated by rival factions who also sought control of the realm? To this day, historians debate the truth, but in that moment, to a grieving mother, the answer was clear. Elizabeth Woodville, the Dowager Queen, and mother of the lost boys, placed the blame squarely on Richard. Heartbroken, she vowed vengeance. Yet Elizabeth was no ordinary widow, resigned to sorrow. Known to history as the White Queen, she was a woman forged in the crucible of war and scandal, capable of turning tragedy into strategy. As rumors of her sons' deaths reached her, she quietly began to plot with England's last remaining Lancastrians. The once feuding houses, York and Lancaster, might now find unity in mutual hatred of Richard III. Elizabeth would wager everything, her name, her daughters, and even England's crown, to bring down the man she believed had stolen not only her children, but the very future of her dynasty. To understand Elizabeth Woodville's unyielding resolve, we must return to her beginnings, a life that began far from the throne, yet would eventually reshape it. Born in October 1437, in the quiet village of Grafton Regis, Northamptonshire, Elizabeth entered the world not as royalty, but as the daughter of Sir Richard Woodville, a knight of respectable gentry stock, and Jacquetta of Luxembourg, a woman whose bloodline carried the prestige of continental nobility. Their marriage itself was scandalous. Jacquetta, the wealthy widow of the Duke of Bedford, shocked the court when she wed Sir Richard without royal consent. For this breach of protocol, they were fined a staggering $1, an immense sum at the time, forcing Jacquetta to sell parts of her inheritance. Yet, scandal often births legend. Together, Richard and Jacquetta became known as the handsomest couple in England, and their union produced 14 children. It was a family rich not in ancient lineage, but in ambition. Through Jacquetta's connections to the royal household, the Woodvilles secured military posts and courtly positions. This access ensured their children, Elizabeth among them, grew up in the shadow of power, learning early that survival at court meant seizing opportunities when others hesitated. From childhood, Elizabeth displayed intelligence and grace. She studied Latin, French, English, mathematics, and law, an unusually comprehensive education for a woman of her standing. Accounts describe her as fair-skinned, with striking blonde hair, and a noble bearing. Chroniclers remarked on her heavy-lidded eyes, like those of a dragon, a phrase both alluring and ominous, as if foreshadowing the formidable role she would one day play in England's blood-soaked dynastic struggle. At just 14, she was married to Sir John Grey of Groby, a staunch Lancastrian. The union produced two sons, Thomas and Richard, binding her to the Red Rose faction in the wars that divided England. But fortune was cruel. In 1461, Sir John was killed at the Second Battle of St. Albans, leaving Elizabeth a widow at only 23. She was left to fight not only for survival, but also for her son's inheritance, a struggle that would put her directly in the path of Edward IV. Here, the story pivots. Elizabeth, a Lancastrian widow, would soon cross paths with the young Yorkist king. Their meeting, whether by chance or by careful orchestration, would ignite one of the most controversial and transformative mid-15th royal marriages in English history, fractured beyond recognition. The 100 Years' War had drained its coffers and broken its pride, while civil war between Lancaster and York plunged the nation into cycles of betrayal, shifting allegiances, and mass bloodshed. It was in this chaos that Elizabeth Woodville came of age, navigating a landscape where loyalty was as fragile as a battlefield truce. The Wars of the Roses were not simply contests of swords and banners. They were battles for legitimacy itself. On one side stood the House of Lancaster, bearing the Red Rose, led by King Henry VI, a monarch plagued by frailty and bouts of mental collapse. On the other stood the House of York, under Richard, Duke of York, who staked his claim through a powerful lineage connecting him to Edward III. By 1455, civil war had erupted in earnest, beginning at the First Battle of St. Albans, where Yorkist forces defeated the king's men and exposed the vulnerability of the crown. Elizabeth, still a teenager, witnessed firsthand the devastation that these rivalries unleashed. Her husband, Sir John Grey, cast his lot with the Lancastrians. When he rode to war in February 1461, it was not just the fate of the kingdom at stake, but also the survival of his family's lands and title. He never returned. John was cut down at the Second Battle of St. Albans, leaving Elizabeth to grieve and to fight for her two sons' inheritance against hostile relatives and political enemies. In this single twist of fate, Elizabeth was transformed from the daughter of a rising family into a vulnerable widow caught between warring dynasties. And yet, this vulnerability may have been the very reason Edward IV noticed her. By 1461, Edward had seized the crown as the first Yorkist king. Tall, charismatic, and militarily decisive, Edward symbolized strength in a kingdom desperate for stability. Accounts differ on how he and Elizabeth met. One tale claims she stood beneath an oak tree in Whittlewood Forest, pleading for her son's rights when the king rode past. Others suggest they had known each other since youth, their families crossing paths in France. Whatever the truth, Edward was captivated. Chroniclers whispered that Elizabeth, armed with beauty and intelligence, resisted his advances until he agreed to marriage. In a world where kings forged alliances through treaties and dowries, Edward's choice was shocking. To wed a widowed commoner, a Lancastrian no less, was political heresy. But to Edward, the risks did not outweigh his determination. And so, in May 1464, in a small chapel at her family's manor in Grafton, Edward secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville. It was a decision that would ignite fury across Europe, alienate his most powerful allies, and shift the balance of English politics forever. When Edward IV revealed his secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the shock reverberated like a thunderclap through the royal court and across Europe. Kings were expected to marry strategically, forging alliances with foreign powers through unions that bound nations together. Instead, Edward had chosen a widow from a family of Lancastrian sympathies, a woman with no dowry and no diplomatic leverage. To his closest allies, this was more than folly. It was betrayal. No man felt this betrayal more keenly than Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. For years, Warwick had been Edward's greatest supporter, the architect of his rise to the throne. Warwick had even negotiated with the French king for Edward's marriage to Bona of Savoy, a match that would have strengthened England's continental standing. When Edward announced he was already wed to Elizabeth, Warwick was humiliated and furious. His influence at court was diminished overnight, supplanted by a woman and her ambitious family. Elizabeth wasted no time establishing her presence. Unlike queens who entered quietly, she embraced ceremony and demanded deference. Even her brother Anthony was expected to kneel before addressing her. With Edward's backing, the Woodville family rose rapidly. Elizabeth arranged prestigious marriages for her siblings, linking them to powerful, noble houses. Her father was elevated to Earl Rivers, and her children from her first marriage were positioned advantageously. To the old nobility, this was intolerable. The Woodvilles were seen as upstarts, commoners intruding on privileges long held by England's aristocracy. But Elizabeth was no mere figurehead. She understood the stakes. By binding her family to the throne, she created a network of loyalty that Edward could rely on against the volatile alliances of the Neville faction. This move, while pragmatic, only deepened resentment. Warwick, once indispensable, now found himself sidelined. His anger simmered until it boiled over into rebellion. Yet, even as tensions grew within the court, Elizabeth's hold on Edward remained unshaken. Chroniclers suggest the king was genuinely enamored with her, rare in an age when marriage was usually political calculation. Their union symbolized something new, an assertion that the king would rule as his own man, unbound by the dictates of advisors. But this love came at a cost. The political fractures it created would plunge the kingdom once more into bloodshed, rebellion, and betrayal. By 1469, the consequences of Edward's defiance had become painfully clear. The Nevilles, once pillars of Yorkist strength, turned against him. Warwick, embittered by the rise of the Woodvilles, and his own diminished influence, allied with Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Their pact was sealed not only in shared grievances, but also in blood. Clarence married Warwick's daughter, Isabel Neville, binding their ambitions together against the king they once served. In July that year, the alliance struck. At the Battle of Edgecote Moor, Warwick's forces defeated the royal army. Edward himself was captured and held prisoner. For a brief moment, Warwick stood as the true power in England. Elizabeth's father, Earl Rivers, and her brother John were executed, victims of Warwick's purge of Woodville influence. Elizabeth, heavily pregnant, was left to wonder whether her family's meteoric rise had brought them all to ruin. But Warwick's triumph was short-lived. Without Edward's authority, the kingdom slid into disarray. Support for Warwick and Clarence collapsed, and Edward was restored to power by September. Yet the cracks in his reign could not be healed so easily. Warwick fled into exile, crossing the Channel to France, where an unlikely alliance was forged. Once sworn enemies, Warwick and Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, united in their hatred of Edward. In a stunning reversal, Warwick pledged to restore the very Lancastrian king he had once helped depose. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's position remained precarious. She sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey in 1470, when Warwick briefly succeeded in his gambit, restoring Henry VI to the throne. There, within the sacred walls, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, Edward, the future Edward Thrive. In that moment, the White Queen became a symbol of resilience, clinging to hope, even as her husband fled into exile. Edward's return in 1471, backed by loyal supporters and Burgundian merchants, changed the course once again. The decisive battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury crushed the Lancastrian cause. Warwick was killed, Henry VI's heir slain on the battlefield, and Henry himself murdered in the Tower. The House of Lancaster was extinguished in all but name. For the Yorkist king, it was a restoration of power. For Elizabeth, it was vindication. Her marriage had survived the storm. But peace was fragile. The ghosts of betrayal lingered in the court, and the resentment toward the Woodvilles endured. Elizabeth, though crowned queen and mother to the king's heirs, knew well that fortune's wheel could turn again at any moment. In a kingdom where alliances shifted like sand, survival meant vigilance, and she would need all of her cunning for the trials yet to come. The 12 years that followed Edward IV's restoration seemed, on the surface, to promise stability. The Lancastrian threat had been extinguished, and the king ruled with growing confidence. Yet beneath the glitter of pageantry, discontent still festered. At the center of it all was Elizabeth Woodville and her family, whose rapid ascent continued to provoke envy and suspicion. Elizabeth wielded her influence carefully but deliberately. She secured wealthy marriages for her children and siblings, tightening the Woodville grip on power. Her brother, Anthony Woodville, renowned as a jouster, scholar, and one of the first patrons of William Caxton's printing press, emerged as a prominent figure at court. Her son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, was elevated to the Marquisate of Dorset. Even her young daughters were positioned for dynastic unions, pawns in the dangerous game of continental politics. For Elizabeth, every connection was a safeguard against future instability. But these moves fueled resentment. Old aristocratic families, already bitter at their displacement, viewed the Woodvilles as opportunistic intruders. Warwick's shadow still loomed. Though dead, his grievances lived on in whispers at court. To many, Elizabeth was not the loyal consort, but a schemer, accused even of witchcraft by her enemies. Parliament acquitted her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, of such charges, but the stain of rumor lingered. Yet Elizabeth understood better than most the fragility of power. She had lived through exile, rebellion, and bloodshed. As Edward grew complacent, indulging in excesses of food and luxury, Elizabeth maintained her role as protector of their children's inheritance. She was pragmatic, but also forward-looking, sensing that the king's health was faltering, and that storm clouds were once again gathering. Indeed, Edward's final years were marked by decline. Chroniclers suggest he suffered from obesity and illness, worsened by a notorious practice of overeating and then inducing vomiting to feast again. By Easter of 1483, his body was failing. On April 9th, he died, just 41 years old. His sudden death plunged England back into peril. Elizabeth, now Dowager Queen, acted swiftly. She moved to secure her son Edward's succession as Edward V, preparing his coronation and surrounding him with loyal Woodville guardians. But the late king had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. This decision set Elizabeth on a collision course with one of the most ruthless power players of the era. What followed would not only seal the fate of her sons, but also alter the destiny of England itself. The days after Edward IV's death unfolded like a carefully laid trap. Elizabeth Woodville, determined to protect her 12-year-old son Edward VI, placed him under the escort of her brother Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, and her eldest son from her first marriage, Richard Grey. With a strong armed guard, they began the journey toward London for the boy's coronation. Yet even as they traveled, forces loyal to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, were already in motion. Gloucester, the late king's brother, had been named Lord Protector, ostensibly a safeguard for the boy king. But in the politics of 15th century England, titles were masks, and protector often meant usurper. With the support of the powerful Duke of Buckingham, Richard intercepted the royal party. Rivers and Grey were arrested, stripped from the young king's side, and within weeks would meet their deaths at Pontefract Castle. Edward VI, bewildered and alone, was escorted to the Tower of London, officially to prepare for his coronation, though in reality to begin his imprisonment. Elizabeth, upon hearing the news, panicked. In a dramatic gesture of maternal desperation, she fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her remaining children, her daughters, and her youngest son, Richard, Duke of York. The sacred walls shielded them from Richard's reach, but not from fear. Chroniclers describe her as grief-stricken, tearing her hair and beating her breast, haunted by the shadow of betrayal. She knew too well what Richard's rise might mean. Her children's claims, and perhaps their very lives, stood in his way. Events escalated rapidly. On June 13th, 1483, Richard accused Elizabeth's allies, including William Hastings, of plotting treason. Hastings was summarily executed without trial. By late June, Richard declared Edward IV's marriage invalid, citing a pre-contract that branded all of Elizabeth's children illegitimate. It was a masterstroke of legal manipulation. In one move, the princes were disinherited, and Richard crowned himself King Richard III. What followed remains one of the most enduring mysteries in English history. Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury were last seen in the Tower during that summer. Afterward, silence. No records of their release, no confirmed graves, only whispers of their murder. To Elizabeth, the conclusion was inescapable. The man who had sworn to protect her sons had instead destroyed them. Her grief hardened into resolve. If Richard had taken her boys, then she would take his crown. Elizabeth Woodville's world had collapsed. She had lost her husband, her protector, and now her two sons, heirs to the throne, were gone, swallowed by the walls of the Tower. But where grief might have paralyzed another, Elizabeth's despair became fuel for strategy. If Richard III had murdered her children to secure the crown, She would answer with vengeance through the only weapon left to her: alliances. From her sanctuary, Elizabeth reached across enemy lines. She forged a pact with Margaret Beaufort, mother of the exiled Henry Tudor, a man with Lancastrian blood and a tenuous claim to the throne. On the surface, it was an impossible union. The Woodvilles had risen with York. The Beauforts clung to Lancaster. Yet in the crucible of crisis, old hatreds could be set aside. The bargain was simple, but brilliant. If Henry succeeded in seizing the crown, he would marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Such a marriage would unite the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, healing 3 decades of civil war in a single symbolic gesture. Henry, then in exile in Brittany and later France, accepted. On Christmas Day, 1483, he swore a solemn public oath in Rennes Cathedral to marry Elizabeth of York. With this vow, the conspiracy against Richard III crystallized. What began as grief-stricken defiance by a widowed queen had transformed into a movement that threatened the very foundations of Richard's rule. Richard, aware of plots swirling around him, tried to consolidate power. He swore oaths of safety for Elizabeth's daughters, restored some of her titles, and even entertained whispers of marrying her eldest girl himself after the death of his own wife, Anne Neville. But such gestures did little to erase the bloodstains of the missing princes. To many across England, Richard's reign was tainted from the start. Meanwhile, abroad, Henry Tudor gathered strength, backed by French regents and fueled by the legitimacy of his proposed Yorkist marriage. He was no longer merely a fugitive noble. He was a rival king-in-waiting. Elizabeth's gamble had transformed him into the spearhead of resistance. The White Queen, stripped of her sons, but armed with her daughters, had set in motion the final chapter of the Wars of the Roses. The storm finally broke in the summer of 1485. Henry Tudor, carrying the hopes of Lancastrian exiles and Yorkist defectors alike, landed in Wales with a modest but disciplined army. His march toward England was a gamble. His forces were outnumbered, his claim fragile. Yet his greatest weapon was not the size of his army, but the promise Elizabeth Woodville had crafted: a marriage to Elizabeth of York. That vow transformed Henry from a mere rebel into the embodiment of reconciliation. Discontented nobles, weary of bloodshed, could now envision an end to the Civil War under a single united dynasty. Richard III, however, would not yield. From Nottingham he rallied his banners, determined to crush Tudor before the rebellion could gain momentum. The two forces collided on August 22, 1485, at Bosworth Field. Chroniclers describe a brutal melee, the last great clash of armored knights in England. Richard fought with the ferocity of a man who knew his crown depended on his sword. In a desperate charge, he cut through enemy lines to strike directly at Henry. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then came betrayal. The Stanley family, long calculating which side to favor, turned against Richard. Surrounded, the king fell. He became the last English monarch to die on the battlefield, his body stripped and later displayed in Leicester. With his death, the Plantagenet dynasty ended, and the Tudor age began. Henry was crowned Henry VII on October 30th, 1485. True to his word, he married Elizabeth of York the following January, binding together Lancaster and York in both blood and symbol. The Tudor rose, red and white combined, became the emblem of a new dynasty. Yet behind this union was Elizabeth Woodville, the woman who had endured scandal, exile, rebellion, and the disappearance of her sons. She had played her final card wisely. By offering her daughter's hand, she had ensured her family's survival and reshaped the monarchy itself. For Elizabeth, the victory was bittersweet. Her daughter now sat beside Henry as queen, and she herself was restored to honor as Dowager Queen. But the price had been terrible. Her sons gone, her brothers executed, her family's name dragged through suspicion and blood. The Wars of the Roses were over, but their scars remained etched in her heart. In the twilight of her life, Elizabeth Woodville, once the dazzling White Queen, retreated into the shadows of political power. After Henry VII's coronation and his marriage to her daughter Elizabeth of York, the Tudor dynasty stood secure. The very dream she had brokered in the depths of grief had become reality. England was, at last, united under one crown. Yet Elizabeth herself became increasingly marginalized, her influence curtailed by Henry, and, perhaps more significantly, by Margaret Beaufort, the king's formidable mother. Some sources suggest Elizabeth willingly withdrew to a contemplative life, retiring in 1487 to Bermondsey Abbey. Others whisper of political maneuvering, that Henry distrusted her lingering Yorkist ties, especially as pretenders like Lambert Simnel and later Perkin Warbeck claimed to be her lost sons. To neutralize any potential threat, the Dowager Queen was quietly pushed from the stage. Still, she lived with dignity, granted a pension, and treated with respect, even if not with the full grandeur her station once commanded. Her final years were marked by both simplicity and reflection. She visited her daughter, the Queen, and witnessed the births of grandchildren who would carry forward the bloodline she had fought so bitterly to protect. Among them was the future Henry VIII, whose reign would reshape England once more. But Elizabeth herself would not live to see the full splendor or turmoil of the Tudor dynasty. On June 8, 1492, she died at Bermondsey Abbey, aged 55. At her request, her funeral was modest, stripped of pomp. She was laid to rest beside Edward IV in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, reunited in death with the man for whom she had risked everything. Elizabeth Woodville's legacy is complex. To her enemies, she was an ambitious interloper who poisoned the court with Woodville influence. To her allies, she was a survivor, a mother who leveraged every ounce of wit, charm, and courage to defend her children. Historians still debate whether she was manipulative or merely pragmatic, but one truth endures. Her actions altered the destiny of England. Without her gamble, there may have been no Tudor dynasty, no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth III. The story of Elizabeth Woodville is not just that of a queen, but of a woman who defied the limitations of her age. In scandal, in sorrow, and in strategy, she embodied the volatility of 15th century England. Her name, though sometimes overshadowed by those of her descendants, deserves its place among the architects of history. The Wars of the Roses ended not on the battlefield alone, but also through the relentless will of a mother who refused to let her family be extinguished.